Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Morning. All right. Hey, cousin. Yeah. Oh, good. All right. Thank you. Well, very glad you came to join today's session. I'm going to talk today a little bit about Native Seed Search, the nonprofit based in Tucson, Arizona, where I work with Joel Johnson, our farm manager, and assistant farm manager Deshawn in the back. Um, And so when I first got reached out to by Tiffany, she said, "Can you talk about, hey, the value of arid adapted seeds and culture?" I said, "Sure, that's what I can talk about." But then she said, "Well, by day 2, people might be ready to do some hands-on and not just sit and listen, but to do." So part of today, I'm going to talk about how to save seeds, right? Okay, let's say you're a gardener, you're a farmer, and you want to preserve your seeds, save them for the next season for whatever reason that might be. I'm going to talk about kind of the basics that one needs to know before doing that, or that will help in that process. And then Joel and Deshawn are going to help us actually save some seeds. So we'll demo okra, corn, chilies, tomatoes, and different ways of processing. Yep. Okay. So let's see. Wonder. Oh, there we go. So as I said, I'm from Native Seed Search. That's where I work as the Director of Agriculture and Education. Now, Native Seed Search, based out of Tucson, has been around for 40 years. And the reason it exists is because of this issue of a lack of crop diversity, right? A loss of agricultural crops and a worry about this. We're in a zoo today. This morning we got to walk around. I saw a jaguar. It was very cool. All sorts of wonderful flamingos, very cool animals. And zoos are pretty cool, right? But they're also, it's not exactly what you'd hope for where that animal is. They exist because of crisis, because there's been a disruption to how that animal lives, and there's a purpose of education and conservation to educate people about these animals and why they're important. And that's kind of the thinking behind Native Seed Search, but we're agricultural crops of the Southwest. Now, why is this an issue? So we show this a lot. This graph is showing different varieties, like different crops, and how many commercial varieties for that crop were available about 100 years ago. So this is post-settler colonialism. This is your backyard homestead farmer. They could access 307 kinds of sweet corn. That's what was available in catalogs throughout the US. Let's think about radishes, 463 different kinds of radish varieties available to farmers. Tomatoes, 400 kinds of tomatoes. That's an immense amount of diversity. 80 years later, right, now we're looking at the 80s, we see a huge loss of that diversity. Now from 307 sweet corns, we're down to 12. From 400 tomatoes, 79. So again, we think about this with wildlife species, right? And a lack of, or a loss of our species diversity and wildlands. It's applying that thinking to our agricultural crops, that there's similarly a loss of that diversity that is important to preserve. So the Food and Agriculture Organization, they're a branch of the United Nations. They did a study, right? Because this was coming up. We're losing this crop diversity. And they said that since the 1900s, right, when there was still 300 kinds of sweet corn, since then we've lost 75% of agricultural crop diversity. That's a big number. Think of this room. We're all different crops, different varieties. There's only 25% left now. And there are implications for that, as those of you who are involved in agriculture and farming know. One of the implications is you lose seed that's adapted to thrive in particular conditions, right? The particular corn of your area, the particular tomato. For out here, That's a loss of seed adapted to our high temperatures, our alkaline or high pH soils, lower high elevations, right? We have from 500 feet up to 6,000 feet in Taos and other places in New Mexico of this region. And of course, our drought, low water conditions. So rather than growing the Punta Banda tomato, which is from Baja California, if anyone's been out there, it is dry. It's hot. That tomato was cultivated by Seri communities, indigenous communities of that area. It grows just fine under high temperatures. But instead, everyone's growing the beefsteak tomato. That's what we're used to. That's what we see in the store. And then they come to us and they say, I can't grow tomatoes in Tucson. I've given up. I said, have you tried the Punta Banda, the Chiapas wild, the Texas wild, the varieties of our region? Most of farmers in this area are growing Midwestern varieties. You know, the talks have been so good this conference, but I was listening to the varieties the farmer was recommending, beets and kale and spinach. And I thought, oh, that's great. But what about what's from here, or what could grow well here? What about the Punta Banda tomato? Okay, this is different corn varieties from Mexico. This is just a snapshot of land races, they call it, right? Traditional varieties adapted to grow in a place over generations. Look at all that diversity. Different colors, different shapes, different sizes for different locations. Highlands, lowlands, humidity. Some for tortillas, some for pozole. So this idea of farmers saving a portion of their seeds from each harvest for replanting in the future is not crazy. This is what we always did. It's how we got all the varieties we have today, all the crops of today. There are wild plants that farmers selected from to adapt to their particular conditions. This is what was done. And what that does is create locally adapted varieties suited to their particular environment. Unfortunately, we're relearning this. We're reconnecting to this because most farmers have stopped this practice for reasons I'll touch upon. So you get these traditional varieties, like this is chapalote corn. It's one of the oldest corn varieties known. From central Mexico, it's a popcorn. Look how beautiful. Coppers and browns. Diversity within the variety. Now they tend to be less similar than your commercially available varieties that are bred for uniformity. But we lose something when we lose that diversity. Now, plant breeders understand this very well today. It's called your gene by environment interaction. And that's utilized in plant breeding. It's how you get different phenotypes, right? The look of a plant, the characteristics of it. This idea that the environment within which a plant grows affects how it expresses itself, its particular traits. And so if we want a drought-tolerant corn, we're going to grow it under low water conditions. We're not going to take it from Maine and plant it in Tucson and go, uh-oh, why isn't it growing? So we utilize this today for our breeding efforts, but it's what was always done, right? Adapting to our particular place just through saving the best of the season for replanting. Now this is a whole other lecture, challenges to preservation. How did we get here? And I give a lot of talks with the public and farmers and gardeners about this. And I just put it all in one slide. But I always try to make sure people kind of understand that people didn't just up and stop saving seed. Just like they didn't up and stop farming. There are reasons, which many people at this conference have talked about. How did we get here? For the traditional varieties that we steward in the Southwest, because of our indigenous peoples who've been here, who've stewarded crops for thousands of years, part of our loss to our traditional seeds of the region are the colonial losses of land, water, and lifeways. Now there are changes in how and what we farm. Let's fast forward. You know, when we talk about this, I often mention like Gila River was a flowing river at times and an agricultural system based off that. You dam that river, you stop the agricultural lifeway because people can no longer farm. But again, that's a whole nother section of talking. So we'll move on because we're going to get to the positive of how do we save these seeds now. So, okay, let's fast forward to the 50s, 60s. Farmers are farming. By 1960, 95% of US corn was hybrid. Now, that's not GMO, that's just the introduction of high yielding, super producing seed. Right? Seed companies figured out if you take two inbred corn varieties, cross them, you get hybrid vigor. It's called that first generation produces really well. So farmers, rather than saving their seed, said, well, geez, I'll just get that super producing hybrid vigor corn every season. And so they stopped saving their seed. That totally changes things, right? Now by 2020, fast forward, you've got the introduction of GMO crops in the 70s. So by 2020, half of US cropland is being grown in a genetically modified crop. Again, drastically changing how and what we farm. So by today, corn, sugar beet, and canola can be presumed to be genetically modified from the US or Canada. Now, where does our sugar come from? Not sugar cane, it comes from sugar beet. Most of our corn products, this is all grown using GMO products, right? GMO seed. That is seed no farmer is saving. You can't, there's patents on it. So again, it just restructures our relationship to the plants, to the practice of seed saving by what we're growing. And lastly, the corporatization of farming. This has been mentioned, that we've lost over 500,000 farms since the 80s. Now, part of that, you less farms, less people saving seed, less people growing these different varieties, less small farmers with that diversity of crops who might save seed if so inclined. Now, what that means with less people farming and less farms is this disruption in knowledge transfer. It's particularly pronounced in native communities where I come from. We lost our land on Poitan Renape. We lost our land, we lost a lot of lifeways. And so you lose that knowledge transfer. It's the same when you lose a family farm, right? That knowledge doesn't get transferred to the next generation of how to farm, how to grow. So that to me is the big loss of this, less people farming and less people growing, is now you have the young people who want to get into it, who maybe didn't grow up with it. So there's a lot of learning that has to occur. And I'm going through that myself as I farm, Okay, so the majority of crop diversity lies in traditional varieties. You saw that chapalote corn. This is a wheat from Asia, Mandarin spring wheat. You see all that diversity? It's like this room, right? The nice thing about diversity, you get a drought, some will survive. You get a pest, some will survive. What happened is those have been replaced with modern cultivars, again, bred for uniformity. Problem with that, pest comes in, drought comes in, they're all the same. There's not that resilience built into it. But it's great for a combine, right? For large scale agriculture, because it's all the same height. There's some Casados multicolored corn from New Mexico. How beautiful. First, our modern spring, our feed corn, right? Going for cattle. Most of what's grown in the US is that. Again, uniformity for mechanized agriculture. There's reasons why it's like this. Okay. So what we lose in that, diversity, resilience, adaptation, identity. One of the greatest joys of working at Native Seeds is the partnerships I've built over time, the organizations built with organizations, groups, farmers that are doing this work of bringing back and growing their traditional crops. So what we've got here is some Apache red corn, grown up at San Carlos. And one thing we hear back from this community in particular is how proud the kids felt learning of their seeds, learning of Apache squash, Apache corn. That's a very important thing to feel proud in life and to be part of a culture and the continuation of it. So this brings me to native seed search. With that in mind, okay, so here we had by the 80s, this loss of crop diversity, less people farming, changes in lifeways. There was the founding of this organization in 1980 to conserve and share the seeds of the Southwest. Arid-adapted seeds, traditional seeds, primarily food crops. So it was a period of collecting these seeds, which resulted in hundreds of crop varieties of corn, beans, squash, chilies. It's amazing the diversity. Crop wild relatives, tobacco. Most of the seeds are affiliated with the indigenous communities of the Southwest and Northwest Mexico. Of course, because they're their seeds. They develop those seeds. They are the farmers of the region. So this includes several communities of the area. Dene, Tono Atam, Akmal Atam, as well as Mormon communities, Italian families. It's a tapestry of who has inhabited the cultures of this area. So we've got a seed bank where we store seeds down in Tucson. We've got a garden, a farm, where we grow these seeds out. Some of these go into distribution, right, to distribute to the public or partners. Some go back into the seed bank for future preservation. This is our fencing. I always try to mention this because this is a big question we get. How do we keep out ground squirrels? Hardware cloth with roof flashing on top. We dig that down a few feet with a ditch witch, make a trench, put that fence in. It doesn't stop everything, but it helps. Otherwise, they crawl up it like a ladder, the squirrels, so the roof flashing helps them slide on down. So our model of seed conservation is, it's no good for those seeds to just sit in that seed bank. That exists. The USDA has seed banks. There's that Svalbard in Norway, right, the Doomsday Vault. And those, the model of those is, okay, if something happens, the apocalyptic event, these seeds will be here one day. Or for the USDA, these seeds are stored for researchers to improve varieties. So we'll have all this genetic material. And so our work, yeah, we preserve seeds for the future, but really it's about conservation through distribution, that seeds are best conserved when they're being grown and shared and used today. So that happens through the retail of seeds, right, to the public. Anyone can access seeds. Native American seed requests, these are free seed sharing programs. For tribal members of the Southwest, they get access to free seeds. The idea is they're their seeds. Money shouldn't be a limited factor. You have a right to them. Community seed grants are for school gardens. Any of you who are doing a school garden, a community garden, a food access project that's trying to provide food to your community, there are free seeds available to those programs. And then we do a lot of donations to cultural events, ceremony, educational days, things like that. And lastly, we work with farmers to help us grow out the seeds. So we work with about 30, 40 farmers throughout the Southwest to help us grow out those seeds. The idea is, okay, we can do some in Tucson, but all the better if they're being grown in the community where they're from. And even more so that the farmer keeps the majority of those seeds that they harvest. Some come back to us, so we can keep conserving them for the future. But the idea is the farmer keeps most of it, so seeds remain home. Oh, these are those school gardens. So much good work's happening at that level, at the school gardens or community serving farms. I'm constantly impressed of how much these groups are doing, how much food is being grown, and how much community impact is happening at that level. Okay, so what are these crops? Why is this important? Beyond diversity, right? What's different about the crops from out here versus the Midwest are desert adapted traits. Now, some of those are deep and extensive root systems. A thick cuticle or, oh, I'm going to stop using that. If I just speak, can you hear me? Okay. A thick cuticle or waxy layer covering the leaves. So if you've ever touched like the tepary plants, tepary beans, you'll see it has that thick layer. It's like a sunscreen, and it reflects the sun, that waxy layer. Short season or early maturing. That's super smart. Think about, we get our monsoon season for 2 months, about 2.5 months. So you've got corn varieties from out here that grow in 60 days you can harvest. So they just make use of that available moisture, they grow fast. It's a very smart adaptation. Phototropism, oh, that's just a cool one because they move with the sun to avoid sunlight, right? Kind of like heliotropism, which is that a sunflower follows the sun. It's sun-loving. Where some plants, like tepary beans, are a great example of that. At midday, they'll go straight up, their leaves, to avoid that direct sunlight, moving back down later in the afternoon to catch that sunlight. But you can watch it over time. And then the smaller narrow leaf shape, right? We're not in the tropics. We've got plenty of sunlight. So leaves don't need to be huge, hence those small tepary leaves. And you can see this in the wild plants, but you can also see it in the agricultural crops, these types of adaptations. Which is why those Midwestern varieties suffer out here. They just don't have those same desert adaptations. Okay, what are some of the crops? Amaranth. That's a wonderful crop. It's been grown out here for thousands of years, and you can use every part of it. The leaves are edible, the seeds are edible. You can use it for dye, as is done up at Hopi with the Hopi red dye amaranth. A beautiful, versatile plant. Okay, cowpeas. This is one of my new favorites. It just is okay with the heat. It's from West Africa. The leaves are edible and can be used as a feed for animals, for cows. But they produce a nutritious bean. But you see that waxy coating on there? So the middle of the day, you don't see its leaves really shuddering from the sun. It's pretty cool with that heat, with that direct sunlight. So we've been really happy. It can be a nitrogen fixer, and it comes in all different varieties. Yeah, but cowpea as a heat tolerant, fairly drought tolerant crop. Okay, I was mentioning that Punta Bando tomato. Here's the Chiapas wild tomato. Again, we're not growing a beefsteak out here. It's tough. People do it in the greenhouses and with shade cloth and other ways, but what really do well are the tiny cherry type tomatoes. So again, as you're planning your farm or thinking about it, there's been great advice of having a profitable market farm or even a larger organic farm, but thinking of what are the varieties that can be well adapted to this location. Okay, so some of these smaller tomatoes. Sorghum, anyone grown this? Yeah. Do you get the aphids? Yeah, that's a big issue with it. But you can plant it. I've planted it in June and it grows right up. So it's extremely heat tolerant, prolific plants, a lot of biomass, a lot of green material. And you've got deep roots that can help your compacted soil. Let's start saying you're starting a new garden, right? You're going to start a community garden or a new bed. Put some sorghum in there first. You don't have to water it too much. You'll get some biomass, but you also get those roots to break up the soil. Okay, the grains are edible. Most of the brooms in the US used to come from sorghum varieties, broom corn. It can be pressed for syrup. Most of the southwestern varieties, like Apache sweet sugar cane, they'll call it, are really sorghums that were pressed for their sugar, made into like a molasses. Okay, now we've got the 60-day corns. This is one of the most impressive crops of the Southwest, in my humble opinion. As I was mentioning, these are varieties that from planting can be harvested and eaten in 60 days. Makes sense with our rain season, right? So they're Tono Autumn 60 days, Akmal Autumn 60 days, Fort Mojave. You see these varieties throughout, right? It's a short stature corn. From seeded to harvesting in 60 days, that'll be at the milk stage. But again, it's edible. You can let it go a little longer to harvest for dry seed, to roast, and save seed from it. But again, a very impressive, well-adapted plant to our climate. There are more beans than I can mention. So here are just a few of them. How beautiful. When I'm talking about diversity, part of it is just, this is vitamins, this is nutrients, but it's cultural connections too. And it's beautiful. The jack bean, this is a perennial bean. Also an animal feed too, but if you can get it through the winter, it'll come back and grows these super long beans. It's from Central America. It was traded up. They found beans around Tucson from 5,000 years ago. Pretty cool, of this jack bean. Lima beans, and here we've got the tepary beans. One of the most desert adapted crops. In fact, it doesn't produce well with too much water. We had a good monsoon about 4 years ago, and we weren't getting our beans. They were too well watered. They need that stress to trigger flowering, to trigger fruit production, to trigger the seeds to grow. Okay, and lastly, wheat, because I studied barley a lot, so I've got a thing for the grains, but wheat's been grown out here for a very long time, introduced by Father Kino in the 1600s, but it fit well into traditional seasonal plantings, right? There were summer crops of the corn, squash, tepary beans, but there was this winter window where there wasn't a traditional crop, and so the introduction of wheat from the Spanish and garbanzos, that fit into the winter season. So it's been grown out here. In fact, the Arizona and some of the native communities like Gila River were exporters of wheat back east during the Revolutionary War. It was a grain basket, primarily with this white Sonoran wheat, but it makes a great winter cover crop. And again, even if you're in it's your backyard garden, put some wheat seeds in there for the winter just to revive your soil, keep it healthy. It doesn't have to be in a huge field. I think that's often what people think with grains. It's like, well, I'm not planting an acre, so what's the point? There's several points. It's your soil health. Yeah. Is it safe to save seed from that small plot? Will it be personal? Yeah, for your purposes, for replanting again. Yeah. Okay, so we've got the white Sonoran wheat, but they're all these ancient grains. Now they're kind of gaining popularity, right? And you can find seeds of them more. But emmer wheat, that's one of the oldest wheat varieties from the Fertile Crescent. Very heat tolerant, doesn't need much water or fertilizer, and they're beautiful plants. Okay, this is a picture of my farm. And I share this because this is personal for me. Yes, I work at Native Seed Search and I care about my work and what the organization is about, but it's also my livelihood too, and my dream to have a functioning farm that can produce well in Tucson weather and to find crops that are well adapted. And it's something I'm trying to figure out as well. What will people purchase? Will they buy Punta Bondo tomatoes? And what can I grow well? And so the point of this all is just to encourage kind of opening our minds of what else could we grow besides beets and kohlrabi, that I don't know where kohlrabi is from, but it's not from out here. So, all right. So, any questions about anything I talked about before? Because now I'm going to switch into the seed saving 101.
Go back to your farm picture.
Okay.
Just tell us what the crops. I see onions.
Yeah.
And just kind of name it.
Sure. This is all garlic. Okay. Yeah, we've got Spanish Roja and Ishlam Red. We tried a few different varieties. And then spring onions, Breckenfield onions, which was a family, the Breckenfields, that bred the spring onion year after. They just selected and grew it out. And it does great. It grows nice, healthy, big onions. And we did not fertilize this field before we planted in it. Then we have some fava beans. That's another great winter crop. And we have, that's cilantro over here. We did a lot of cilantro. And then the orange flowers are all calendula. Yeah. So we were selling that to an herb store in Tucson because people make salves like Deshaun. Yeah. Yeah. It's good for your skin.
Calendula salve that I made with the flowers that I grew at home. It's really good for your skin if you have eczema or dry skin.
This is all barley. And then we tried rye and we tried oats. The oats were very nice. Yeah. That was a nice cover crop. Any other questions? Yeah. Oh, Nepales? Yeah. We have it, and we've been pondering, should we? Because it's a very low water crop. The processing is intimidating, and then growing desert crop seems a little silly in terms of like we have water to irrigate. So maybe we could have can we get them from the desert or plant an unirrigated area or less irrigated? But we're just trying to make use of, we have arable farmland. Can we grow some things? But it is on our mind some. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so with the traditional varieties,
yeah.
How do you know how to water or not to water?
How do you know?
Yeah.
Well, I think for us it's like other crops. I mean, you're trying to grow it successfully. So one thing we're trying to do is adapt to how that crop may have been watered before. Like think about how it was once grown. So for example, for that autumn 60-day corn, there's the auction farming, right off of the monsoon rains. There'd be rain-fed fields. So these are not frequent waterings, but deep waterings. So then we switch to drip flood, we're calling it, where we're on drip irrigation, we're in the city, but rather than putting on a little bit of drip irrigation every day, we're leaving it on for 5 hours, once a week, once every 2 weeks, to get that water really deep into the roots. Yeah.
So when folks get seed from Native Seed Search,
yeah,
do you provide that irrigation guidance?
Not necessarily. It's up to the grower. We provide guidance on planting time and seed saving that crop, but not necessarily how to grow that variety for everything. Some things we have some information on our website and in guidebooks and things, but otherwise not necessarily. There are some things of like how to plant and spacing, things like that. Yeah.
Because I have a nice big patch of temporary.
Okay.
And I'm traditional Western kind of farming.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing that leaf behavior.
Yep.
Oh my gosh, I gotta water.
Yeah.
But now I know I don't necessarily have to water. I want to encourage it to flower.
Right towards the end of the season, if it's okay, it's time, you could taper down a little bit. And we might have, I think we do share that with temporaries, don't overwater. For things like that, we try to let people know when it really makes a difference. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's get into seed saving. So how can we save our seeds? First, we have to start with how are seeds made. And it is not the stork. Yeah. So it's the birds and the bees. It really is. Or the wind, or it can self-pollinate. So we'll talk about these different ways. Now it all starts with flowers, right? Yes, flowers are beautiful. We enjoy them. There was some great jasmine all around the zoo. It's really nice. But the flowers are there for reproduction, right? For the saguaros, it's to attract the bats at night to pollinate. For coffee, peppers, all of our seeds are coming from flowers being pollinated. That's wheat flowers, even wheat. If you look close up, it's got small flowers, male and female. Okay, so flower structure and sexual reproduction, we're going to do a little plant botany. But basically, you have male flower parts, female flower parts. The male's the stamen, that's got the pollen producing parts on it, right? Those yellow anthers, that's what's covered in pollen. And then you have your female pistil, this, which has the stigma, this part, which is sticky to catch that pollen. So your homework after this, you're going to walk through the zoo on your way out and start looking at all the flowers and see, do I see those parts in them? So now in this flower, we've got both, right? The male, female. It could self-pollinate. Because that pollen, it's not a far distance to get to the stigma, to travel down to the ovules, the ovary, where the eggs are. So just like a woman, it's the same. This is Sex Ed 101. Yeah, it's the same process, pretty much. So those eggs get fertilized, and that's what develops into the embryo, the seed. And the fruit is just the protective layer around that seed, the mom's belly. So let's see, examples of anthers, right? The pollen-producing structures. Here's a lily, so nice. Now we've got a squash flower. Now some flowers, as you see, have both, right? The stigma and the anthers, male, female. But some just have the male parts or female parts, and we'll get into that. But you're going to notice that these are the stigmas. Like I said, sticky, right, when you look close up to it. All there to catch that pollen. Okay, and examples of ovaries and ovules. If you look in the base of that flower, if it's a female flower, a perfect flower that has both, it will have these unfertilized ovules or eggs. Once fertilized, that's what turns into your seed. And most of our crop plants, this is how they function. It's pretty cool. Pollen's also pretty cool. It's structurally diverse and species specific. So there's corn pollen, sunflower pollen, it all looks very different. That's just a fun fact I like sharing. Yeah. Broccoli pollen. This is how archaeologists know what was grown in a place thousands of years ago, hundreds of years. They can, look at pollen samples. Just like males, it grows this is what pollen looks like. When it lands on the stigma, it grows a pollen tube to fertilize. There are YouTube videos of it, but you can watch it grow that tube down to fertilize the ovule, right? It grows that tube all the way down to fertilize the eggs within. Yes.
Was that pollen or sperm?
It's pollen. Wow. Yeah, that's all pollen. Yeah, it starts as a circle, but then once it lands, it'll grow this pollen tube down and then send its sperm cells, basically, the male gametes, the sperm cells travel down that tube to fertilize the egg. Yeah, it's really cool. Yeah. It's so similar. That's the beautiful thing, I think, is the metaphors we have of the similarity between us and plants. It makes sense. We're produced the same. So like I said, the fruit is really, there's the protective coating, the protective layer around the next generation, around the seeds, around the little babies within. Okay. So flower structures can determine how pollination occurs. So you're going to leave this and know, like, oh, that's a female flower, that's a male flower. Okay, there needs to be crossing or there doesn't need to be. So if you have a perfect or complete flower, like I said, that's what the botanists call it, where it has both male and female parts. It's capable of self-fertilizing. Those are really easy to grow and save seed from and get a fruit from or crop from, because you don't have to worry about the birds or the wind or anything doing that job. It can happen on its own. the flower is capable of self-fertilizing, it can produce its own fruit. This is a chili flower, for example. So chilies can self-fertilize. Now, for most things, it can be improved by insects for most crops. And we'll get into that, but it's just good to know, okay, I'm planting this plant, and is it going to self-fertilize or is it going to cross-pollinate? For something like this, I'm not too worried about it cross-pollinating with another chili, right? Because it self-fertilizes, it self-pollinates. So I could say, okay, I can have a red chili, a spicy chili, and a mild chili, not too far apart, and it should be okay because they'll just fertilize themselves. Now, the caveat is because it's improved by insects, you might need some space to make sure that insect doesn't carry that pollen between. But here we go. So perfect or complete flowers, you self-pollinate. Beans are a great example of this. If you've seen the flowers of a tepary bean, they're very tiny. And it's very hard for a bee to get in there anyway, even if you have a nice bee population. So I can have brown teparies next to white teparies, and I'm not worried about them crossing. I can have white beans next to black beans next to pinto beans, and they're not going to really cross. Small flowers that that are capable of producing their own fruit. Yeah? Cowpeas, chilies and peppers, cotton. Pictured here, beautiful flowers, okra, eggplant, tomato, and lettuce. These are all crops that will self-pollinate. Now, the caveat is because, like, look at that beautiful okra flower. It's nice and open. Bees like to get in there. And so if I had, like a Texas red okra and let's say a green or Texas red, and I don't know, another, like, let's call it blue striped okra, because the bees might carry pollen between, I want to space them a little farther apart because it's still possible. Whereas for my beans, I'm not as concerned. Does that make sense? It depends the species, it depends the crop. And I've got some handouts of like the different spacing on it. But for okra, we say about 150 feet is enough. Yeah.
But isn't that okay? Because then you're developing more diversity with getting new varieties.
Exactly. It can be okay. It's not okay if you're trying to maintain your variety. Like if I just want Texas Hill okra and I don't want it to cross with anything else, or then yeah, you want to separate it. But if you're really not that worried, or you want some of that mixing, sure, you can plant them closer. Yes.
Is that like why you want to keep your sweet corn and your popcorn far apart that you're planting?
Yes, 100%. Yep, different types will cross. It's the same species. Yep. So, okay. Now, some of our crop plants have what's called imperfect flowers, or basically they have either male or female flowers. And usually these are on the same plant, which is nice. So you'll have male flowers, female flowers, and you can tell because they look different. They have the different reproductive organs. Our squash family is like this, right? Where they tend to have different male and female, where they always have different male and female flowers on the same plant. But somehow the pollen from the male flower has to get to the female flower in order to get a squash, which is often why when people just have one squash plant, they don't always get a squash. Or there's not a lot of bees because this is done by bees. So hence our pollinators are so important. So we see this in our watermelons, our zucchinis, squashes, anything in that, gourds, anything in that squash family has that type of reproduction. Again, once the flower is fertilized, it'll develop a fruit around it. And you can tell, right? This has a straight stem. This has already, before it gets fertilized, the female flowers have a little bulge. It's the ovary. Yeah. And then inside they look different too, right? Just the anther with the pollen versus those stigmas. Yep. Yeah.
I'm trying to remember, it's been years ago, but I melon too close together, and the watermelon was like flavorless, sugarless, tasted more like a cucumber. And a couple of people told me, well, don't you know you can't plant those close together? Do you know which those would be, like melon and cucumber?
They won't cross, but what could, there's the Armenian cucumber, which is actually a melon. So that's happened to a lot of people where then they think it, so if it was an Armenian cucumber, I'm not sure, but sometimes that's the case. There are a few cucumber varieties that are called cucumber, but they're not actually cucumber, they're a melon. They taste just like a cucumber, but they really are melons, and that can be the case.
No, it was like the watermelon or the cantaloupe.
Yeah.
Turned out real
Bland.
bland, yes. And I want to say it was because they were, I was told they were cucumbers.
Well, the other, I wouldn't say that's the reason, because the other thing is you won't see it in that first season, because it's in the children in the next generation that you see the product of the cross. So, yeah.
So I haven't planted
Weather.
since then because
Oh,
I can't remember what it was.
yeah. Now maybe it could have happened in the past. Those in the previously, that watermelon crossed with something and it lost its flavor, or was the growing condition something happened? Yeah. Yep.
I have had Armenian cucumber that in that season grew like a normal one and then got pollinated by a watermelon, which is, I thought it would happen to the children, but that cucumber was very watermelon.
Well, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Did you show that the peach is a perfect? The previous slide you had a peach.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Peaches. A lot of fruit trees have this. They have separate flowers.
All varieties of peaches are like that?
I can't say for all variety. Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure, but generally they have separate. Like the flowers are either male or female. Yeah, papayas like that.
That's on the same plant.
Yeah, yeah, and then yeah, peach I believe is on the same plant versus papaya is on different plants.
Right.
Yeah, is that okay? Yeah.
Have you noticed any like pollinator preference for any different types of varieties?
Oh, not necessarily. Can you? Yeah, I wouldn't say for different varieties, but certainly different crops. You know, like they'll like squash or they'll like certain things. Yeah.
I was just thinking about how bees are attracted to purple and blue. You have any squash varieties that have purple or blue flowers?
Oh, they've all had yellow flowers that I know of, or like yeah, or orange. But that's, I wonder if you could encourage pollination through that way. Okay. Yeah.
I just want to mention that there are squash bees that are specific. Yes. Yeah. They will love those. Yeah.
Okay. So here's our cucumber, watermelon, male, female flowers. Just like you mentioned. Yeah, that's good. So many native species of bees found within Arizona, including the squash bee. Talk about coevolution. Are these plants working together with the bees? They throughout the desert southwestern Mexico. It's one of the few bees that pollinate squash plants. Again, how important the pollinators are. Okay, to the corn question. So corn is wind pollinated, but similarly to the squash, you have the male and female flower on the same plant. The tassel's the male flower with all the pollen. And that pollen has to get down to the silks, which are the female flowers. They don't quite look like flowers, but that's what they are. And so, or what they function as. So just like with the other plants, basically the silks are like those stigmas, and the pollen lands and travels down that tube to fertilize the ovule, the kernel, within that ear. And if that fertilization occurs, then you get the kernel, the ear, yep, which is the fruit. Okay, yeah, silks attached to ovules. And then once fertilization has occurred, those silks would detach. They turn brown, they start falling out. But it's a way to know, okay, my corn's getting ready. Yeah.
What is detasseling and why? I grew up
Oh,
in
okay.
Nebraska, so
Yeah.
we grew a lot of corn, and I always hear about kids getting these summer jobs detasseling. I have no idea.
It's probably for corn seed is what's being grown, and they're taking off the tassel so that that pollen doesn't land. They're going to cross it with some other pollen. So they don't want the pollen from that plant to land on to fertilize that corn. So exactly. Yeah. Will you share that one?
There should be a row every 10 rows or so. I don't remember how many, where you basically leave the tassels on. And then because they're wind pollinated, that's enough corn to fertilize the other plants that are tassels. Then you get your F1 hybrid, which is very productive.
Because it forced the cross. Yeah. So you prevent this from happening from self-pollination. Okay. Okay.
That's why it's very easy with corn. With wheat, it's very hard to do because you have to, pull out stigmas out of the flowers and the tiny corn just go up top and leaves them there.
Is that clear? Yeah. Okay. Sure. These are good questions. So let's see where we. Oh, I was just showing this because sometimes you don't get kernels all the way through. Like that's still a pretty good ear of corn, but we often sometimes we'll get spotty corn, right, where not all the kernels got fertilized, and that happens because it didn't get pollinated. Now, corn pollen can desiccate, dry out at high temperatures. And so Tucson, we're growing corn and it's 100 plus degrees and pollen has a hard time. That's why it sheds early in the morning. You want to create some humidity to keep that pollen viable. Sometimes those silks, they'll emerge later in the season, and so they don't get a chance to get pollinated because the pollen came out, let's say, a week before the silks did. So they're not timed right. Yeah, and that happens. Okay, so to summarize, the wind-pollinated crops, corn, wheat, amaranth, and sorghum. The caveat with sorghum amaranth is they can still self-fertilize, but they typically pollinate with the wind. Yeah. And lastly, our insect pollination. Like I said, all the squashes, gourd, melon, watermelon, tobacco. And once you start looking at the flowers, it makes sense. Like tobacco is those long tubular flowers. They're very scented. They're beautiful. It's hawk moths that stick their long proboscis into there and pollinate. But it makes sense, the flower structure, for how it pollinates. Basil, chia, cilantro, sunflower. Yep. Yes. Oh, that sometimes you need to like trip the pollen's up here, and the female flowers or parts are here, and if the flower of a devil's claw is tubular, okay? And so it needs an insect to crawl in there and kind of shake it up to get that pollen to fall. Yeah. It's cool. And sunflowers, they can self-pollinate, but they're what's known as self-incompatible, which is kind of cool. For that genetic health, they'll reject their own pollen often to get pollen from another plant. Yeah. So they want to date. They want to mix it up. Yeah. They can tell because they basically like block. They don't. Yeah. Like the egg doesn't won't accept those male cells into it, the sperm of it, the germ cells. Yeah. They can tell. There's some level of communication.
Well, I'm trying to think in mammals, I think seed
Exactly.
because
It won't.
it won't unlock whatever, however it's sealed until
Mhm.
the right cell. Something about the communication.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, very similar in that way. Yeah. Yep. Okay. That's it for me. Now we'll stand up and get our hands moving a little bit. Do you have any questions though at all about um, saving seed?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that when you're doing the corn that you needed to provide some humidity. What do you guys do on your?
One thing we started doing is in the morning watering the ground or the plants a little bit just to keep it moist in there.
Nothing over it.
Not overhead, yeah, because we don't want it the pollen to get wet actually, because then it won't fall down. Yeah. But create a kind of microclimate in that. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, especially when it's still been hot when they're flowering. Yeah. Yeah.
So like with the older varieties of corn, if you overwater, isn't it like training it to need water?
That's a real concern. Yeah. Yeah. Like each, if you that can happen. You're adapting it to new treatments, to new conditions. Yeah. So that's of something we're trying to work on is maintaining adaptation while still growing productive plants.
Yeah, that's the challenge.
Yeah, that's the challenge. Yeah. Yep. Mhm.
Another question on corn.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So there was a species called Mexican June corn.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We've grown it. Yeah.
Okay. Was that considered a native, or is that just
Do you want to share, Joel? Do you know?
Yeah. Maybe we'll transition. I'll pass around some
Okay.
of these dry seeded crops, and we can look at some of these. So this one's I'll pass around a few of these. This one's the autumn 60-day corn, but there's also autumn June corns, and maybe some other folks can chime in if you've grown some of these other varieties. So June corn is a type of corn. There can be June corns from all different communities and areas as well.
Well, there's an ask is my mom's always talked about it, like, well, we have Mexican June corn to make tamales, and up here in the valley, no one knew what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so I went to St. David and
Yeah.
And there's lots of so one of the things that you can do is go to our website nativeseeds.org, and in that resources document we have a public facing database called adapts. You can look through all 1,800 varieties that are in the seed bank, and you could actually look for June corns, and it'll pull up all the different types, whether those are from an autumn June corn or from a different region in Mexico, and you could look for a type of corn based on your elevation or your rainfall or the community that it's associated with, or all these different things, and see, okay, I'm looking for this type, and that's why that diversity of the varieties is so important, is because some of those are fitting a very specific window of planting at this time to be harvested at this time, or they're for a very specific purpose. So this is a pozole corn, this is a tortilla flour corn, this is a corn that's going to be parched or roasted at that 60-day milk stage. So it's called Adapts, and you can just go to our website and check that out too. And one thing that's kind of unique about the seed bank is that anytime, and I was just going to mention while we pass these around, and then I want to make sure, I'm going to go quick on this so Deshaun can show you all that. So these chilies here are Chili del Árbol de Baja California. And then this other chili I wanted to pass around is one we're actually having some trouble with, this Chalaca chili. Some of these are dry seeded crops, but we're having a hard time dry processing them because it's a thicker walled chili. So even though chilies are something that you would dry out the fruit, and we want the seed for seed production, we want the fruit to stay on the plant as long as possible to absorb as much of the nutrients and reach maturity as well as it can. But we get into this kind of tricky window. One of the tensions of the seed production and seed processing is we don't want the dehiscence, we don't want it to drop the seeds and we just lose them because it stays on too long. but we also don't want it to be immature. And on a few of these varieties, the okra, I picked a few that were at maturity and a few that are a little bit under maturity, so you can kind of see some of these too. We don't want to have immature seed because it won't be viable and it won't be. It may look exactly the same as the other ones, but once it dries, but it was immature, it was harvested too early, and that seed's not going to grow. So we want to do some of that selection in the field, and then some of that happens in the seed processing. Do you have a
Could you use some kind of bagging to prevent the separation if it does
Absolutely. So you can do that, and depending on the variety, there's different ways to go about that. On something like tepary beans, there's so many in the field that usually we'll wait till about 70% of them are dry and ready, and just cut the whole plant and then put them on a big, mesh tarp or something like that, and then let them dry. For other things, you can bag them. Absolutely, we'll do that with sunflowers. And then you run into things like, okay, there's a monsoon storm coming, and all of that seed that's almost dry is going to get moldy if we leave it in the field. So you're kind of making those decisions too of, it's really close to being at maturity. So what we'll do sometimes there is cut the sunflower at the soil level and then hang them upside down in a ramada or something and get fans on them. Let them finish that drying process to maturity. That would happen in the field ideally. That can sometimes happen in the seed lab or in the storage area as well. Yeah, so when we did this last season, I was thinking of the sunflower because we just did this. It was a spring planted sunflower that got really big and it got some watering. It just didn't dry before monsoon came, and so we cut them at the soil. We hung them up in the ramada. We put fans on, and then we got some of those like mortar mixing tubs from Home Depot, and we just stuck those underneath so that as the seed fell, some of that would collect. Or we'll take the frost cloth, like that frost cloth, the remay fabric. Once it's retired and it's got too many holes to use in the field, we have some volunteers help us cut squares out of that and sew bags for seed protection. So when the birds are getting to them, you can put that remay fabric over the heads in the field as well.
Is that one same variety that you passed around?
Yes, it is. It is. And so this is a great example of this autumn 60-day in the same variety. Most of them are white kernels, but some of them have purple kernels. Some of them have pink. And so for our goal as the seed bank is we're not developing anything new. We're just trying to maintain what has already been bred into those for generations over the course of hundreds of years. So what we'll look at is what are the notes from whatever community or individual farmer has been growing that variety, and then that's what we try to select for. And sometimes we miss the mark. Like we just don't have enough information of what are we selecting for. And one of them that we like to share with people is the Glory Basho, the muskmelon. We got some feedback from some autumn elders that the melons that we were saving seed from, those don't look like what I saw as a kid. Those don't look like what my grandparents planted. And so the benefit of this seed bank is we could go back through those seed lines and go back to the original seed, scrap the more recent growouts that we said, okay, these are drifting. There's a genetic drift that's happening because we don't have the right selection information to say this is the right one or this is not. Some of them were getting too big or they were getting not flavorful enough. And so that was kind of a cool opportunity that we would love to do more and more often, where actually I think, David, maybe you grew out some of that when we did that Guribasho. I think Jacob Butler did some at Salt River, Pima Maricopa. So we went back to the original seed of that variety and so Mission Garden grew some in Tucson. We grew some at the Conservation Center. I think maybe David or somebody else at Gila River grew some. Jacob grew some at Salt River. And then we brought together 50 melons to Mission Garden and did a tasting day. And elders came and looked at, and we put out 50 different melons from those 4 different grow outs. And people could say, yep, that's the right size, that's the right color, that's the right flavor. And then we could start saving the seed again from those. We just did this with a tomato as well that a family in Tucson has been growing for 75 years. And they said, you know what, we're not really happy with the seed that's happening anymore. And so they started it fresh again, gave us new seed stock, but then we also got to have some phone calls with Al Nichols, who actually he just passed away a couple months after we had that conversation with him, of what are we looking for in this tomato? What have you all selected for over the last 80 years? Why is it important? So having that information, and then to your point with the question earlier, your goal may not be to maintain a variety. You may be wanting to do something different, to look for changes and follow those and select for those. So we've had corn varieties that have come into the seed bank. There was an Autumn June corn actually that was all white with a few blue speckles. Somebody who was working with that corn wanted to have a blue June corn because there hadn't been one before, at least in southern Arizona. And so they spent 12 years growing that corn out year after year, and every year they selected for the blue. And after 12 years, they had stabilized a blue June corn. We don't interact with that process, but then they brought back that seed and said, I really want that to be part of the seed bank so other people can grow with that, because there had been growers who wanted access to that variety. So now we have, it's the same corn variety, it's the same genetics, the same line, but now it's a separate cultivar with that variety. So now we grow that one out too, and we select for the blue kernels instead of the white. And all of that one of the differences we've been trying to communicate, and Andrea in the outreach, is what's different about the seed bank versus a seed house or a seed company is our goal is not to keep selling you the seeds every year. We would much rather that you get the seeds you get the seeds from the seed bank and maybe a variety you haven't had, and then you never need us again. That's awesome. Like, then you become the source for your community and your friends and neighbors. And one of the things, I just want to mention this one thing, and then I'll turn it over to Deshaun. He's going to do some wet processing of the seed, is just how we set up the seed growing to maintain that vigor, to maintain that genetic health. Andrea mentioned, how many plants are you saving from? When we lay out the farm at the beginning of each season, that's the first thing that we're looking at, is what is the variety of this plant? How does it pollinate? Is it wind pollinated? Is it a wheat? Is it insect pollinated? Is it something like a lima bean, which is self-pollinating but has a bigger flower than a tepary, so it's attracted to insects? We need to have an isolation distance for a tepary bean or a pea, it's only about 20 feet, because as Andrea said, that triggering process of the pollen sharing and having that pollination process, that's happening as the pea flower opens. So by the time it springs open, it's done. It doesn't really need the insect. They can get in there, but it's very low risk of crossing. And so we can do peas, skip a bed, go 25 feet, and do another variety of peas, and we're good. But something like the lima beans, bigger flower, more attractive to insects. Now we need to go 150 feet. Fava beans, bigger flower, more attractive to those bees, 450 feet. The jack bean that Andrea showed, the big mason bees and the native bees, they love that flower. They just go crazy for it. Okay, now we're looking at 800 feet. And so depending on the variety, the isolation distance is different. And then that size of the genetic population is different, because we don't want to be working with this corn and we're only saving from 40 plants year after year after year. Over time, inbreeding depression sets into that variety for corn, because like Andrea said, that corn wants to be pollinated by its neighbors. It wants to have that cross and that vigor and that genetic sharing. So if we only save from, let's say, 20 corn plants year after year, and I'm working with this variety and I only do 20, over time, that single corn plant has become so genetically similar to its neighbors that it starts rejecting its neighbor's pollen too, because it thinks it's its own. And so we start getting this inbreeding depression where we didn't have enough genetic sharing there, and now the corn is not pollinating, and the temperatures were right and the plants were healthy, and it should have worked and it didn't. So there's different protocols for how that happens. Most of us in the seed bank, we start with a regeneration sample. So that's enough seeds to plant a genetically healthy population of that crop type. For something like watermelon, it might only be 50 seeds. For something like corn, it might be 300. We were up here in December for the Western SARE conference, and Dr. Pratt at New Mexico State, he said his protocol for corn is plant 1,000 plants, harvest the seed crop from the best 400 on the inside of that block, and then eat the rest. And then from each of those, okay, this is one of the best 400, only harvest like the middle of that corn. And that's my seed stock, the best of the best. But then the USDA GRIN just had a conversation with Andrea and some of our other staff. They've got a different protocol. Okay, we plant 100, we take 15 kernels from every ear. These are from the same grow out, very different ears. They take 15 from each, because for that goal, we want to maintain all the diversity of that variety year after year. We're not selecting for the best season to season. We've been kind of in between the two of, we usually plant 300. We're trying to bump that up because it's getting hotter and hotter, and so we're seeing more pollination loss. So with 300, we're not hitting that number enough. So we're bumping up to 600 or 1,000 plants just so we can get that good pollination set.
Yeah, it was fun. One of the varieties I grew from Guatemala, and it started. The cob I was given to was pure white. It was like the small white one there, and then the first generation from that, I had blues and purples and greens and small cardinal, a small cob, a big cob. It was
Yeah.
gorgeous.
And that's how we got all those. You know, there's 570 types of corn just in the seed bank, and that's how that happens. Somebody wanted, I want a small one, I want a green one, I want a blue one, and that's opportunity. That's great, but that's also where the open pollination comes in. Why it's so important. You can now make that decision as a grower. I want this or I want that, and you can develop it. Whereas if it's not open pollinated, you don't have that choice. You got to go buy it again next year, and you can't change and develop very easily, at least.
Yeah, I just grind it and make really good.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah.
I know that you partner with growers, and I'm just curious if you provide coaching as people get started in this, because there's like so many variables and elements that go into the crosses and what have you. So how does
Yeah.
that work?
Yeah, I would say it goes both ways too, because our growers are providing coaching for us and our staff too, of we're asking those questions. How are you doing this? What's important? What are those things? But Andrea is your resource there as the partner grower. We're growing out in Tucson. Andrea's working with 40 plus farmers all over the Southwest, so that varieties that are from the low desert, we keep growing them in the low desert. High desert varieties, Hopi varieties, we were just talking about that recently. Doesn't make any sense for us to grow Hopi varieties in Tucson. It's so different. So working with growers who are in that community, making sure those seeds go home and continue to adapt to those locations. And Andrea is your resource as a partner farmer to ask questions, to develop. And then you become the resource for our staff on that variety of how can we pass on that information. You've maybe grown it 1, 2, 3 seasons. Now you're getting to know it, and you can say, okay, here's how I irrigated it. And we can pass on that information. But all of this is communal too, of if we don't have enough room to grow out, maybe you don't have room to grow out 600 corn ears, but you can do 75 and you can do 50 and you can do 100, and then we can pool that together. That's a very traditional practice of mixing corn from the same variety that was grown in different fields. And then we're hitting that genetic number together where we can't do it individually. And we're adding that strength and that vigor and that diversity to the crop that way too. Yeah.
Elephant in the room, I guess. Are the native seeds more pest resistant? And what is your pest management?
Yeah, so most of our pest management has gotten a lot better as our farm has gotten healthier. So as we've been adding in habitat for beneficial insects, as the soil's been getting better, the healthier the plants have been, we've seen a huge drop off in the need to spray, to do those things. We're usually trying to just set a threshold of a healthy seed crop. And if there's pests on there, but they're happening right now, we're getting a lot of pests with the monsoon rains, but the crops are healthy. They've already set seed. We're just going to let them roll. And then that's food for the beneficials. We have, I would say, seen the vigor of that plant because it's from the low desert and it's been grown out by an Otham community for 500 years, 300 years, whatever it is. It has so much less pest pressure because it's healthier and it's not stressed out by the saline soil or the drought or the heat. That's, stuff happens. New things are popping up that haven't been in the region before pest-wise, and sometimes it just wipes something out. But we're seeing, for the same reason these are productive, they're also healthier and more pest resistant in a lot of cases too. Okay, I'm gonna stop there, hand it over to Deshaun so we can do some wet processing of seeds.
I don't think this is on, by the way.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Hello, I'm Deshaun. I'm the assistant farm manager at Native Seed Search, and I'll just be going over wet processing of these Nichols tomatoes, which Andrea talked about earlier. These are a tomato variety that has been grown by family in the Tucson area, right, for quite a bit of time. I would say about quite a bit, 70 years, right? Yeah, 70 years. And it's kind of funny because every time I go to harvest or have volunteers, I say, oh yeah, we have a pretty big tomato here that we could harvest. And I consider this tomato to be like huge, even though it's actually not. But when you look at the other ones that could take the heat and take this climate, they're like microscopic almost. So this tomato, I just really, I adore it because it's such a big tomato in my opinion for this region. And it's also, do we have a knife or should I just, yeah, cool. And it's also, it has a mild flavor, but it's still, to my opinion, in my opinion, has like a great flavor. And I made salsa the other day out of it, and it came out really well. And it has like a pretty mild, unique flavor. And so with these tomatoes, since it is kind of not a cherry tomato, we are able to save the skin and the the protective layer and eat that or make salad out of it. And then we just get the seed and the juice in the middle. And we go ahead and put this in here. And you just keep doing this with every single one. And it's a little bit different than our other tomato processing with the cherry tomatoes that we grow, like the Punta Banda and the Cuidad Victoria. Those ones we unfortunately aren't able to really save the fruit and eat it or share it because it's such a tiny tomato that we ferment the entire fruit. And then what we do though is we compost all of the leftover gunk from the processing, and we just throw that in our compost and it goes back into our farm. So there's no waste. It's just a different method of consumption. And pretty much with this variety, it's been growing really well at the farm. We have a grow out right now of Nichols, which I've been stoked about because I really enjoy harvesting it. It's been really fun. And I also enjoy just bringing other people out there because people kind of trip out when they see a tomato growing amazing in the middle of the highest temperature of the summer. And these were actually rotting for quite a bit. And then they started doing better again when they started growing up. So they obviously they can't evolve in one season. I mean, somewhat they can, but not in that way where they'll start growing completely different. But they do have these mechanisms like any plant to where they will notice that they'll put more seed out if they do certain things. So they started growing straight up instead of growing out. And so now we're getting really great harvests out of these tomatoes. So this little harvest we have here is just a fraction of what was harvested a couple of days before this event. And also they take the heat well and they take the monsoon well. They're in a basin field, so they are getting irrigation as well as rainwater. So they're loving that and they are doing quite well. And I assume that they'll keep producing until the fall. And so we're kind of getting a bumper crop right now, and that may continue until November or even later, depending on how cool our winter is. They also are a great tomato for making salsa because they are quite juicy, but they have a thick skin, so you could make a pretty thick salsa out of it. And you don't need a whole lot of fruit to make a good batch of salsa from it. I don't know, but we do have a Prescott heirloom tomato as well. Yeah, so that one does really well in those regions. It's kind of funny because I purchased those and thinking that it would do well from the website because when you look at native seeds, you think everything could take the heat, but like Joel and Andrea mentioned, a lot of our stuff actually will struggle out here because it's grown in Hopi or it's grown, in Dineta or somewhere up north or just somewhere that is not as hot or not as dry. So it's definitely an interesting thing. And going back to that, I know a creator online that grows the Hopi blue corn in the Midwest, and it does really well because even though it's not high desert, it is kind of a similar climate, and they have a nice long summer, and then, or I mean, a mild summer, and then they have a long winter over there, kind of like Hopi and Navajo Nation. Yeah. So I'm gonna be dropping this like seed and this juice into this cup, and what I would do is after getting all the seed into there, I will fill this cup up to about, I would say right here, usually like not much water. You don't have to fill it up all the way, and then we leave it uncovered, or not uncovered, my bad. We leave it covered but open a little bit for 2 days, and that ferments the fruit and makes it to where it'll be a viable seed. and it'll also make it to where we'll be able to finish it and clean it. So you do, I don't think you need to do that, but that gets rid of all that coating and all that stuff that the seed comes with, and it does that quick removal of that for you. So you could throw this tomato into your garden and it will grow a new tomato without any of that, because nature has a way. But this just helps us with our farm and our mission to harvest the seed quite efficiently and promptly. And so we ferment it for 24 hours or for 2 days, and then after the ferment process, we dry the seed and clean the seed. And with that, we just get the seed, and I'll go over that. I think I'll have enough time. And with that, we get the seed and we strain it and we fill it up. We put it in a bucket and we just keep filling it up with water and cleaning it until the water becomes clear and all you have left is seed and maybe a couple little bits of tomato and then water. And once that water is clear, we could obviously drain the water and then strain the seed. And then we could just dry the seed with like a cloth or with a rag. And then we put that seed onto a drying rack, something like this. I know sometimes we use like a one that has smaller circles, but it looks similar to that. And we dry that seed for a bit. And then from then, it's kind of hands off with me. And then that goes on to the seed lab and the seed bank. And they pass on, they take that torch and finish the process and distribute that seed.
So what's the purpose of the fermentation?
Yeah, it's just like the fermentation. I think Andrea might want to step in, but from my knowledge, it's to get rid of all that the seed coating. So every seed has like a protective coating, and naturally it would still wear off, but it could take a year, half a year. Like you need rain and you need weather, and sometimes you need cold weather for like a winter, early spring wildflower. You need a cold snap in order to get that seed viable. But if Andrea, did you want to mention anything else as to why we ferment it?
Sure, that the gel around the tomato seed, it has germination inhibitors in there, which is why typically the seeds won't sprout in the tomato. And so that gel, we're trying to break that and get rid of. And so fermenting it, it's lactobacteria. So when you leave it for 2 days, or I've left it longer even, and it gets that a white film on top, and that's helping to break down that gel. So that after you strain it, rinse it, and dry it, it's what the seed left without the gel around it. And then you can do it. Oh yes, I work with all different seed banks I get, or just with the. Well, it's good. So he just passed out the melon.
Uh-huh.
Do you want to share with?
Yeah, so this one, this is a melon mexicano cantaloupe. And so the cantaloupe needs that too, but not quite as long. It has that wet coating on the seed, but it only needs to ferment for about 24 hours. And then we were just talking about watermelon, and as we were talking about it, we realized some of the partners we work with, they process totally different than we do. For watermelon, we usually just put it in water for a few hours and just let that kind of sugary coating get off and a little bit of dish soap. And then you can process the watermelon seed very quickly. But Andrea was just saying somebody that works in southern Arizona does big watermelon wells. They put it in the vat and they process it and then they ferment it for 5 days, which is very different than what we do. And really the end goal for all of these is just to make sure that the seed is germinating at a high level. So there are federal standards for each different type of seed, of being able to distribute it and make sure that it's quality seed and will be able to grow well. And so you can do germination tests at home. Maybe you've done this before, like with a kid's classroom or something, just putting them in paper towels and rolling them up and seeing, okay, I put 100 of these in, 72 of them germinated, that's my germination percentage. So we do that for every single grow out that we do. And we also use that as a way to maintain and check how are the seeds doing that have been in the seed bank. So if something was harvested in 1983 and in that year it was germinating at 100%, let's check it again at 1990, 1995, 2000 and see that's going to slowly come down and then we need to regrow it again. So again, the ferment and the processing, the end goal of all of this is just to make sure that seed can germinate really readily when we put it in the ground.
So it's more it's like quality control to get a certain germination level. Because for a home gardener, I cut a tomato, I just take a piece of paper towel and wipe it down, let that dry, and then wipe down.
Exactly. That works.
Yeah.
For us,
Yeah.
we're doing such quantities, like they're filling up
Yeah.
buckets.
Joel,
of this,
do you want me
and
to
so
demonstrate it with
it's
the food
like,
processor?
this just makes
Yeah,
it
sure. You
easier.
can throw them in there.
I don't think that we
Show people.
usually use